Welcome back for breakout session number 3 from dorm room to classroom, effectively responding to critiques from friends, peers, and professors. This session is going to be led by two people that I think the world of, and so I'm very excited to be a part of this session. Sherif Girgis is going to speak first or second? Second. Cassandra Hough is going to speak first, and so I'll tell you a little bit about her first, then I'll tell you about Sherif, and then we'll let Cassy speak first. She'll speak for about 20 minutes, then Sherif will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll be able to open things up for conversation. Cassandra Hough is a graduate of Princeton University, where she received her Bachelor of Arts degree with concentrations in religion and East Asian studies. As many of you probably know, in 2005 she founded Princeton student group the Anscombe Society, which has received national attention for supporting the institutions of marriage, the role of the family, and chastity on Princeton's campus. In 2007, she was named the winner of the William E. Simon Fellowship of Noble Purpose, as well as recipient of the Spirit of Princeton Award. In that same year, Cassy founded the Love and Fidelity Network to meet the needs of college students looking for resources and support to start initiatives similar to the Anscombe Society on their own college campuses. Cassy is one of the contributing authors to the recent book, Women, Sex, and the Church, A Case for Catholic Teaching, and she and her work have been featured by the New York Times. It was an exciting moment to see that, both for its own sake and to see Elizabeth Anscombe's name in the New York Times, something that really only otherwise would have happened at her death, I think. The Washington Post, the Glenn Beck program, Bill Bennett's Morning in America, and other publications and shows. And she lives with her husband and an unbelievably cute daughter in Princeton, New Jersey, where she continues to assist the student leaders of the Anscombe Society. Sherif Girgis, born in Cairo and grew up in Delaware. He majored in philosophy here at Princeton, where he won several academic prizes, including the 2007 Dante Prize for the nation's best undergraduate essay on Dante. His senior thesis on sex ethics won the Princeton prizes for Best Thesis in Ethics and Best Thesis in Philosophy. Upon graduating Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude in 2008, he went on to earn a master's degree in moral, political, and legal philosophy at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He's now a philosophy Ph.D. Student at Princeton, and also a law student at Yale Law School. His paper, What is Marriage?, co-authored with Robert George and Ryan Anderson, was published in December by the Harvard Law Review, and this is really a considerable understatement. Quickly became SSRN's most downloaded paper of the previous year, by a magnitude of 1 million or something. I mean, it was just staggeringly downloaded and read. Really very influential paper, and one that's really going to set the standard for the conversation on this issue for the next decade or more. And so thank you very much for coming, and I'd like to welcome Cassandra to speak.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming, and especially to this session right here. It's a real privilege. Usually as an organizer of a conference, you're running in and out, throughout all of the sessions, and so it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to actually talk to you all, during this session. And it's also a great privilege to be joined by a good friend and former classmate of mine whose work on these issues, marriage, family, and sexual integrity, I admire really greatly as well. What we'd like to do during this session is I'll provide kind of the context for our conversation, provide some general guidelines for some of the obstacles that you might face on campus, and then Sherif will follow me with some more practical tips to how you can negotiate the conversations that you have on campus. So there tend to be two primary reasons why young men and women like yourselves decide to take a lead in these issues on campus, communicating your commitment to marriage, family, and sexual integrity. First, the first reason, and the primary reason why you tend to do this, is a desire to balance the university conversation, the university discussion, and to correct what is often a biased perspective, where only more libertine notions and norms in regards to marriage, family, and sexual integrity, human sexuality and relationships are presented. You want to balance the conversation in respect to these issues. The second primary reason why students like you tend to take a lead on campus is to offer support to your peers in striving to live out their commitments, striving to live lives of integrity in their sexuality and relationships. Now, what I see connecting these two reasons and what's very relevant for our discussion today is that they have at their heart a dedication to what we believe to be true about sex and love. We believe that the education we receive in college should help us to make well-informed, intelligent decisions about what we believe to be true and how we plan to order our lives according to that truth. That one side of the story, the side defending the institution of marriage, the special role of the family, and sexual integrity, is missing or inadequately presented on campus, we perceive to be an injustice to our peers. Not only are they at a disadvantage for understanding these important and sensitive issues fully, but they are also at a disadvantage in making the very important life decisions that undoubtedly affect their physical and emotional health and the stability and health of their relationships, if not now, in their current reality, then certainly in their future. Many of you are no doubt here at this session today because you desperately want to enrich the understanding of your campus community in regards to these issues. Not just because this material is very interesting, to talk about, but even more so, centrally so, because this knowledge is so central to the well-being of those around us and to the health and flourishing of society as a whole. No doubt many of you are also here at this session today because you've observed or experienced many obstacles in trying to be leaders on campus, balancing the conversation, and supporting your peers to live out their commitments. Now, these obstacles are many and varied, and I look forward to the Q&A when we can hopefully have a discussion about some of the particular obstacles you face on campus. But for now, I'd like to offer some general guidelines or observations for how you can best prepare yourself for certain obstacles on campus or respond to those obstacles. So first, in communicating your commitments effectively, and hopefully this is very obvious, but it's important sometimes to state the obvious. In communicating your commitments effectively, you need to realize that you won't be able to persuade others if you do not sound persuaded yourself. Now again, this is obvious, but in the way that university discussion tends to happen today, this doesn't always necessarily play out. Today's campus discussion is often dominated by an orthodoxy of relativism, right? So oftentimes, both on the part of some professors as well as our fellow students, together we'll see the tendency for them to steer clear of making any sort of objective claims about what might be true or good. And instead, classroom conversation or dorm room discussion for that matter kind of tends to take the form of, well, this is true for this person, this is true for that person, kind of a more superficial exchange of these types of ideas and opinions. Now this runs contrary to showing ourselves to be persuaded about our commitments, right? Because if we're saying, well, this is true for you, but this is true for me, well then that totally negates the fact that we are convinced that there are certain objective truths that are truths for everyone, right? So if we're going to communicate effectively on campus, we can't fall into the relativism trap, okay? We can't fall into that mode of conversation. Now, people can and do have differing opinions and lifestyle choices, and we can be, and we should be, respectful of their freedom to have the opinions that they do, and to decide to live as they choose. But while we respect their freedom, we can also very reasonably judge the validity and consistency of their claims, of their opinions, as well as judge the consequences or point out the consequences of their lifestyles and behaviors. Now, of course, don't misunderstand me on this point. We should not judge the person, and I think you hear that in many of the arguments and resources on these types of issues. We don't judge the person, but when we're critiquing or assessing the claims and the arguments, we can do that reasonably. We can judge them, judge those opinions, judge those arguments just on their merits. Or on what they don't offer. Okay. So now if we're going to, so we shouldn't judge the person, but we can judge the arguments. And we can assess the legitimacy of their claims just as others can and often do assess the legitimacy of our own, right? So there's a real exchange here, and what we are committed to doing, what we are in the business of doing, is promoting a dialogue, right? So others readily assess our beliefs and commitments and claims, and we can feel free to do the same. Now, of course, if we're going to stand up well to their assessment and critique, and if we're going to make a good attempt at communicating our commitments and beliefs effectively, we need to educate ourselves on the rational basis for our beliefs, which all of you already know and are doing this weekend, of course. But let me just take this moment to really emphasize here that being a leader on these issues, and continuing to educate yourself on these issues really does take effort and perseverance, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing that already. You wouldn't expect to enter into a certain profession without having done the necessary study and preparation, doing the right internships, whatever, taking the right courses. In the same way, we can't expect to be leaders on these issues without doing the necessary preparation and study, right? So this is a long-term commitment. Just wanting to be leaders on these issues is a long-term commitment, and it takes perseverance, it takes effort to continually educate ourselves on these issues. Now, while we need to understand how important it is to continue to educate ourselves on the rational basis for our beliefs, at the same time, we shouldn't feel like we have to become experts before opening up our mouth at all. I think many of us, in having a very good intention to want to do justice to what we believe to be true, we feel like we can't say anything unless we can say it perfectly, okay? And what I would like to express to you, during this session is that we need to approach these conversations, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom, as a real learning opportunity. We need to have some humility here. We need to have some humor here. We need to go into those conversations fully expecting that we're going to make mistakes, okay? But take it as a learning opportunity. We need to be careful not to just get discouraged when we make those mistakes or when we don't have an answer. The fact is that the conversation doesn't need to stop when we don't know how to respond to someone. We can set a real standard here because, obviously if we want to have a really candid and fair, balanced civil dialogue conversation with our professors, our peers, our friends, then, if we expect them to acknowledge when we've made a good point, right? If we want them to acknowledge when we're right, or at least to say that we're not wrong, then we need to be able to be willing to do the same thing ourselves. We need to be able to say, yeah, that's a good point, or, I didn't think about that, let me get back to you. And it's okay to, acknowledge that they're thinking intelligently about these issues, of course. There are very intelligent arguments to be made on either side. But the key here, and I'll just reiterate this, is that the conversation can't stop there. Once we acknowledge that we don't know an answer, we need to go out and find that answer. Again, it's a continuing educational process here. And of course, the Love and Fidelity Network tries to make ourselves available to continuing to educate you on those issues. Having an online resource of an online searchable library, so that you can look up, what the experts say on a variety of different questions. Okay. So now, of course, the way we converse with others is a real balancing act. The way that we try to avoid that relativism trap, but still be respectful, of the opinions of our peers and of their lifestyle choices. It's a real balancing act, and it'll take different forms depending on our company, of course. So just focusing on the classroom very briefly, it's usually expected and hoped by the professor that the students will think critically and intelligently about the material, before them, and actually do extra reading, right? They have a suggested reading list in addition to the required reading list. So to do extra reading when they can. What good professor wouldn't hope for this, right? The real critical, intelligent analysis of your course material. So I would say we have a really great opportunity here, and hopefully many of you have already recognized this opportunity. Now, of course, there's a big difference between voicing your opinion all the time and offering intelligent critiques, right? Again, I think in a very well-intentioned effort to represent their beliefs and commitments, as fully as they can, oftentimes I think students will kind of fall into two modes of classroom discussion that tend not to be all that fruitful, right? You'll get the student who really wants to say what they believe on a particular issue, or feels the responsibility to at least be some voice of truth in the classroom if everybody else is only presenting one side. and they'll just kind of pipe in with, well, I think this, or well, I believe that, right? And it's just kind of those little comments that really, we would commend those students, of course. I know I've fallen into that myself. We can commend those students for their courage, because it takes a lot of courage just to offer that you believe something different to what's being said in the classroom. But at the same time, those little comments don't really tend to have anything to back them up, right? Now, on the very opposite side, you get students who, again, with really wanting to do justice to their beliefs, will go on and on and on trying to get out everything, about what they believe, and then that's that, right? And so what I would encourage you to do, and this goes back to what I was saying about, thinking critically and intelligently about the course material, is, don't feel like you always have to have the answer, but certainly come prepared with an answer. Certainly continue to educate yourselves on the rational basis for your beliefs. But instead really focus on asking the really good questions, okay? Asking the really critical questions, the intelligent questions. Half of the battle in communicating yourself effectively, both to friends, classmates, professors, etc., is just getting them to question, to seriously step back and question the assumptions that they're already making. So again, in the classroom, there's a real opportunity here to think, to offer really intelligent critiques of the material, being put before you. And then as far as the extra reading list is, doing extra reading is concerned, obviously, if you're going to offer those critiques, you do want to be prepared with where someone can go, to find the answer to that critique. Right, so again, this does mean a lot of extra work. It does mean a lot of extra research. But obviously, if we want to be able to communicate ourselves effectively in the classroom, we need to have those resources, at our fingertips. We need to be able to have that ready to be able to offer to our classmates and professors. And I'd love to elaborate on classroom discussion more in the Q&A, depending on your particular courses and what you're facing there. But for the moment, I'd like to spend most of the rest of the talk more so on the scenario with our friends. Now, of course, in the dorm room or our conversations with our friends, wherever they may take place, the scenario is quite different than the classroom, but we can think about these scenarios very similarly in the sense that asking the good questions is key here. And we should go about asking these questions in a very loving and charitable way. It's always neat, as an organizer of the conference, to kind of see some of the trends, that come up kind of unintentionally between various sessions. And it was really wonderful to hear Dr. Esselin on Friday night, last night, talk about how, that a person will really only have a chance of having a change in heart if that person is loved, right? And so as we go about these conversations with our friends, or I would say also as we go about our conversations with new friends or acquaintances or anybody on campus, right? If we want to be effective in what we're communicating about our beliefs, I would just echo Dr. Esselin in saying that we do need to reach out in love. We do need to reach out in true friendship. Okay, people will be able to see very immediately, what our intentions are in that conversation that we're having, what our intentions are in talking to them about something, or even asking them questions about what they believe or why they believe it, right? And if they'll be able to see whether we're trying to trick them, trick them into saying something so that we can come back with, already come back. So we need to, make sure that our intentions are good here. Being a true leader means wanting what's good and true for the other person. And so, we need to be able to reach out to our peers, both friends and non-friends alike, by asking them very good questions from a basis of love and with charity. At the Love and Fidelity Network, obviously we believe in the power of human reasoning and intelligent arguments. But again, making these coherent arguments to your friends will do very little, if they don't know that ultimately you're making these arguments, right, or giving them this, data or, whatever it may be, if there's not love behind it. And so this, we're in the business of true friendship here. There's the mistaken belief that it is often an offense to human freedom to enter into the life of another person. When in fact, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Human freedom is only freedom when it leads a person to what's good and what's true. Anything that doesn't lead a person, and we see this in the data, anything that doesn't lead a person to what's good and true doesn't liberate them at all, but traps them. We see this so readily in sexual promiscuity. Sexual promiscuity or sexual freedom, as they would term it, doesn't liberate a person. We don't feel free. We're not liberated. When we're worrying about, let's say the physical harms of sexual promiscuity, STDs. When we're worrying, on the part of women and men too, when women are worrying about getting pregnant. Sexual promiscuity doesn't liberate us when we're struggling with feelings of loneliness, abandonment, dissatisfaction, right? Everywhere we turn with the data on hookups and cohabitation, as Helen Albright shared with us this morning, with the economy as well, although I wasn't able to join that session, we see so readily how whenever we seem to depart from this understanding of the institution of marriage, the valuable institution of marriage, the special role of the family, and sexual integrity, we see that the well-being of the human person, the health and well-being of the human person, the flourishing of society, that's not, whenever we depart from that understanding, that flourishing doesn't take place. Instead, it traps us in the type of social ills that we see so readily around us. So we need to be able to approach these discussions with this understanding of freedom, okay? Being in the business of true friendship, having these conversations with our friends, with our classmates, means helping them to understand this concept of true freedom, okay? And it means having the courage to enter into their life and to know that friendship means entering into the life, of those we love, or our friends. If we're convinced that something is true and good for those around us, then out of respect for the freedom of our friends, out of respect for their ability to pursue what is good and healthy for them, we must be able to share this truth with them. To be a good friend, and hopefully I'm not saying anything novel here, to all of you, but to be a good friend, does mean to take a real active interest, in the hopes and the dreams of our friends, to take an active interest in their struggles and their fears, and to walk beside them in this. I think Helen Albright really nailed it when she said, in answer to one of the questions, I believe, that we need to speak to the aspirations of our friends. And there's a real opportunity here, and especially, if we come back to that, tool that we can use of asking good questions. Sometimes just asking our friends, what is it that they hope for out of this relationship, or what is it that they want in the future? Just helping them to make that connection between their immediate decisions, the habits that they're forming, their behaviors, attitudes, etc., and what that is preparing them for, the logical consequences, that is preparing them for down the road. Just asking them those good questions, and helping them to form those connections, is a great, service that we can give to our friends. But, to do that, we do need to be with them, walking beside them in their hopes and their dreams and their struggles and their fears. Now, of course, this, having these sorts of conversations, entering into the lives of our friends, it's, the Facebook era, and I'm not saying I'm against Facebook, I'm also not necessarily for Facebook, but, this concept of human friendship, it is novel for a lot of people. Oftentimes, friendship can just remain at that superficial level. So it does take a lot of courage to ask our friends the type of deeper, really significant questions about their lives, about what it is that they hope for themselves, their relationships, and their future. And of course, there will sometimes be bits of awkwardness and silence that follow these conversations, especially the more difficult ones. I'm sure some of you have also experienced, losing a friend over communicating, to them what you believe it would be in their better interest, than the behaviors they might be engaging in now. So there is a great risk here. But again, out of respect for their freedom to know, to be able to make well-informed decisions, and out of respect for their freedom to pursue what we believe to be true about these issues, out of a genuine concern for their happiness and well-being, true friendship demands that we be able to enter into their lives and have these conversations with them. So just to reemphasize the point here, when it comes to friends or to a dorm room conversation, we need to be able to speak out of love and concern for the other person, asking the right questions, helping them to evaluate the validity and consequences of their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Asking the right questions, of course, is really key here. We need to be willing to really listen to those around us. And I would make a special point here of, obviously, with our friends, we get into, we spend a lot of time with them, so it's much easier with our friends to be able to see those places where we can say, where we can have a natural opportunity for deeper conversation here. But I would also take this opportunity to kind of elaborate and say that as leaders on campus, trying to communicate effectively your commitments on these issues, we really need to take initiative to engage and make friendships with people who disagree with us on these issues. Okay, there is a lot of common ground here, and this speaks to the natural aspirations that I mentioned and that Helen mentioned earlier too. That and with I'm kind of going off my notes here, but with university administrators and staff too. When it comes to university programs, how course lists are put together, perhaps what the health centers are doing, as well as the initiatives and lifestyles, initiatives that various other student groups are taking, or the lifestyles that our classmates are choosing to engage in. Oftentimes, there are good intentions behind the decisions that they're making, right? University administrators, of course, have the well-being and health of the students in mind. It's just that they have a very different idea of the route students need to take in order to achieve a certain understanding of sexual health and a certain understanding of well-being. Same with our peers. Obviously our peers are usually, behaving in ways that they think will generate health and happiness, right? It's just that they have a different idea of the route they need to take to get there. So we can really, try to meet them at a very human level, of course. Reach out to them in friendship, try to, those of you who lead campus groups, I know many of you are trying to do this, but, reach out to the Women's Center, reach out to the LGBT Center, get together with the student leaders there. There's a real opportunity for very genuine and positive dialogue with the students who may be on the completely other side, of some of the things that you're professing on campus. And, you can really start from, what are the same concerns that we have about human sexuality, or the same concerns we have about human well-being and health, and then candidly and, civilly and lovingly explore both where you overlap, and where you differ. But the point here is, is to reach out in friendship, knowing that there are very common, human aspirations and desires that, that we can sympathize with each other on, and then just help to lead each other, lead our friends and our peers to understanding, whether the choices that they're making now is actually leading them, to the type of results that they need later. The final point that I'll make, and again, hopefully this is obvious, but it's important to mention, is that to communicate yourself effectively with your friends and classmates, you need to be able to live out what you say. You need to be able to bring a human face, an attractive, joyful, intelligent, and confident human face, to the commitments and positions that you represent. I'm sure many of you have experienced on campus, certainly we experienced it here at Princeton, that oftentimes, unfortunately, other people will be very eager to make hypocrites of you. I just remember when the Anscombe Society got started here at Princeton in 2005, immediately just kind of the stories people were writing up about us on blogs that had absolutely no basis, in truth, saying that they were at this, sexually provocative event with, these students, or doing that with these students, and it's just completely untrue, So I think at the heart of others wanting to make hypocrites of us, is really this fear that what we're saying, can't possibly be true, right? So many young people today, just because of the realities around them, really lack hope. I mean, many of you know this and experience this in your conversations and relationships, but many people around us just really lack hope that the types of commitments we profess can actually be lived out, right? And so, for this reason, and they respond in different ways, obviously. But for this reason, we need to be able to both speak honestly about the challenges of, say, defending marriage, or the challenges of living with sexual integrity, right? Because there are challenges in doing that. So we need to speak honestly about it, while at the same time, striving to structure our lives, of course, in accordance with our beliefs. Because it is possible, and hopefully many of us are surrounded by models of how these types of relationships are possible. So we need to be able to put that human face to what we're saying, put that human example to what we're saying. What Dr. Estlin said last night was just so appropriate, and I was so glad that he answered my question in this way. But creating silly fun, right? Just the opportunities for real conversation, the opportunities where our real femininity and masculinity can come out, right? So what we need to be able to do is both, again, know the rational basis for our beliefs, while at the same time cultivating a culture that's going to support our peers and ourselves, right? Because we need that support too. But support our peers and ourselves to living out what we profess to be true. Make it real for other people. Make it practical for other people. It's so crucial. I mean, the way that I started this talk, with the two primary reasons that many of you decide to be leaders on campus being balancing that conversation and offering support to your peers, we can't do one without the other, right? We need to be able to create that culture so that our beliefs and our arguments really have traction, really take form, take life. So just to summarize here, do your homework. Continue to educate yourself on these issues so that you can be ready with intelligent reasons and answers both in the classroom and outside the classroom. Learn to ask good questions, again, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. Half the battle is leading people to change. Half the battle in leading people to have a change in heart or opinion is just simply encouraging them, again, to think critically about their assumptions or the consequences of, where they, the opinions where they start. Base your communication on the foundation of friendship, whether that friendship is already a decade old or a new friendship. Classmates you're reaching out to for the first time, professors, faculty, staff that you're reaching out to for the first time. Enter into the lives of your friends and speak to them out of genuine love and concern for their well-being. Speak sincerely and candidly and help them to recognize where their behaviors and opinions are inconsistent with their hopes for themselves and for society. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, give life to what you say by confidently and joyfully. I mean, we need to live this out with a smile, right? We need to live this out with a sense of humor. I'm sure, with our interaction with students, it's just such an encouragement to be working with all of you because many of you do this already, right? You do live this out confidently with a smile, with a sense of humor. So I would just encourage you to continue to do that and to give that human face to the arguments that you're promoting on campus. So thank you.
Okay, I just have a very jumbled mess of points, tips for having these discussions, and as you'll see, they are in no particular order. The first couple are about style.
and they pretty much reflect a lot of what Cassy said. So the first and most important thing in any discussion, and I'll mainly be focusing on moral discussions, so discussions about the morality of sex, ethics in general, or about how marriage should be structured personally or in the law. The first thing is to be confident and cheerful, never apologetic or defensive. That is the single most significant indicator of how a conversation, I think, is going to go, actually. And I know this because I often go to, I've given a couple talks or done debates on the article that Chris mentioned that I'd written about marriage, co-written. And more than once, I've gone to a law school or a university where everybody's really nervous for me. And they say, the people who organized it say, really sorry, but, these other groups who are very much ideologically against us have sent out these emails saying, come heckle the bigot, and we're really worried, like we've brought extra security and all the rest of it. And you sit in the audience and you can tell by the way people are sitting, they usually kind of sit sideways. Smirk. You can tell who it is. And inevitably, it just takes 5 minutes. 5 minutes of talking with a smile. Doesn't matter what I'm saying, for that to go away. And to talk with confidence. With the confidence that it's not I'm giving an argument that you're not going to be able to poke holes in, but I'm giving an argument that I think is worth sharing and talking about. And it makes all the difference. The tone of the Q&A is never what I would expect going in, seeing the sideways posture. And again, reflecting something Cassy said, you believe that these norms are good for people and good for society. And the sooner your tone and delivery and presentation reflect that, the better. And the line between a dismissive attitude and an attitude of genuine curiosity is very, very fine. I'll give you an example. I was where was I? Oh, I was in a seminar at law school. And one of my friends in the seminar, a very, very sweet girl, said, oh, you weren't in class on Thursday. I said, that's right. She said, well, where were you? I said, oh, I was doing a debate. She said, oh, on what? I said, marriage. She said, what about marriage? I said, gay marriage. We're at the Yale Law School, so everybody's on the right side of history there. So she said, almost just pro forma, oh, and what side were you on? And I said, I was against. And she paused. And she finally came up with something. She said, was it one of those debates where you go and they just assign you your position? I said, no. But immediately, her posture switched from one of like, we're all on the same side here, aren't we? To, oh, well, what did you say? And could you send me the paper? And can we talk about this? It's a very fine line, as I say, between dismissal, because both attitudes, dismissiveness and curiosity, are from a position of ignorance. I don't know what you're going to say. The one is, I don't know what you're going to say, so I feel like I can just dismiss it because I've never had to consider these views, basically. That's why I'm ignorant of them. And the other is, oh, well, what did you have to say? Another thing is, compatibly with all of that, the confidence and the cheer and the rest of it, don't be afraid to admit what you think are the weaker points in your argument and the hardships that living by the moral norms you're proposing imposes. Just be equally clear about why you think, on balance, your argument works. And on balance, it's the goods preserved and protected by living by these moral norms are worth the burdens that they impose. Assume safely that, at least in most of these contexts, people have never heard what you're going to say, and that makes a big difference. I, by temperament, am extremely conflict averse. And my first 2 years at Princeton, I sort of did everything I could to, well, certainly my first year, certainly did everything I could to avoid discussion on these issues. And my assumption always was, A, whatever I'm going to say, the other person has already thought of, so I'm going to look dumb. And B, they've already thought of a good objection to it, they're going to be a step ahead. And if only because they've never really thought about these issues, that hasn't been true. So, that can go a long way towards giving you the kind of naturalness and cheer that I think you should have. It's always very good to anticipate some of the most common objections to whatever argument you're making, and the more you make it, the more familiar you'll be with them. To anticipate them and diffuse them by saying why you think on balance they're not effective. Both shows a kind of intellectual integrity, you're giving them their due. And it also accelerates the discussion. It just makes it more efficient, and it also shows the other person that you've thought this through and that probably it's much more complex than they thought it was. In debates, always pause instead of using filler words. Don't hold me by that here. Use humor to diffuse. People get really serious about these conversations, and very intense and very passionate. And the sooner you can insert a joke, good or bad, the better. They're both effective for the goal, which is just to lighten the atmosphere, lighten the mood. And the last thing about just style or kind of mechanics is to prepare by rehearsing your argument. This is obviously more for a public setting, but in a way it can apply to personal conversations. Go through your argument with friends, with people who are friends and on your side, friends and not on your side, and it just makes you much more comfortable. And the more of the landscape that you think you see going in, the better you'll feel about the debate if it's in a public setting. Okay, substance. One thing is that many times people will object to traditional norms of sexual morality in ways that would apply equally, in many cases, to their own views about sex, whatever norms they do support about sex, and in many cases even to any moral norm. So, for example, it's true that if you live by traditional sex ethics, no matter what your orientation or your situation in life, you'll face some hardships. But that is true not just of a view of sex in which, permanence and exclusivity are really important, which a lot of people who don't share the other parts of our views have, but also for any moral norm. Any moral principle at the edges, so to speak, will impose hardships. You can always think of a case in which it will be very difficult to keep living by it, because in a way that's what moral norms do. They limit us where we have very strong motivations to act otherwise. So you can just sort of show the structural parallel in a way that will just clear out bad objections. Let's get to the good ones, the ones that are really specific to my view, and let's leave aside these that aren't. And another thing is that people will often say, these norms about, these arguments for sex ethics, they're so complex, so many words, it's just suspicious, right? But the truth is that if you look at any ethical issue very carefully, you can produce many words about it. We all agree, everybody agrees that consent is of extreme moral significance in the realm of sex ethics. But there are some really hard cases in consent, in determining what constitutes consent and which are borderline cases and which cases fall on which side of the line. And if you really wanted to get picky about it, and for example in the law very often you do have to, when you're setting norms about laws about rape and sexual harassment and all the rest of it, it's going to get very fine-grained very quickly, and you're going to have to zoom out to remember why you're even worrying about this in the first place. So the fact that that's true of a traditional argument about sex ethics, for example, the argument that I make about same-sex marriage, spends a lot of time arguing about what is bodily union and how could it matter and what does and doesn't count and so on. And the more, if people push me on it, it gets very fine-grained, but that's not an objection in itself, because it would apply to every moral norm. Okay, another thing is, and this will sound funny, but only moral arguments can produce moral conclusions. We're very tempted, I think most people are, but especially in promoting traditional sex ethics, we're very tempted to appeal to science or to history in ways that don't really work. So for example, oxytocin in itself is not an argument against fornication, right? It can show a lot. It can show the effects of sexual promiscuity. So oxytocin is this hormone, I don't know anything about science, but it's this hormone that makes you attached and it gets released in sex and breastfeeding or something. So it makes you really attached to the person, and it works, and it's more true for the female than for the male, I think. And so one argument often goes, oxytocin gets released if you have sex. So if you have sex, you're going to get attached to the person. Or if you're not going to be married to them, that's bad, right? That, you need to say more. And in particular, you need to say something moral. You need a moral principle in an argument for a moral conclusion. Now, that doesn't mean that these have no place. For example, the science can provide a kind of, well, it can point you to the relevant moral facts, right? The fact that this creates a kind of attachment, well, why does it matter whether sex creates a kind of attachment? What can sex be the expression or realization of? Does sex exclusivity matter to that? You know, you can see how you can start with this raw data. And of course, it also shows some of the bad effects. Science can show the effects of different actions, and the effects can be brought into a moral argument, or at least to provide additional motivation for living by a moral norm. But in itself, it can't do the moral argument. On the other hand, don't let your opponents use science in illegitimate ways. Oh, homosexual attractions are natural. There's the gene. We found it in Time magazine last week. Therefore, gay marriage. Right? That doesn't work either. Right? It doesn't matter if desire for multiple partners is really natural, genetic. That doesn't get us anywhere. We have to ask what we ought to do, not what we're biologically inclined to do. Same thing with history, right? So history, just because other people believed it doesn't make it true. But what role does history have to play? Well, a couple. One thing is that it's very useful for disproving immediately some of the most common objections to traditional sex ethics. So, for example, your view is only motivated by fill in the blank, animus, ignorance, religious fanaticism, right? Well, let's just take animus and religious fanaticism. I get this often about marriage. I can disprove that in about 2 sentences, right? Okay, the first sentence is, grant that I'm motivated by all these horrible things, okay? I'm like a really bad guy and a religious fanatic, whatever. There's still an argument you have to answer, which is the argument that was developed hundreds of years before Christianity without any connection to Judaism, and about 1900 years, no more than that, more than 2,000 years before the concept of a homosexual identity had any salience at all, right? Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Xenophanes, Musonius, Rufus, Plutarch, none of these people know what Romans chapter 1 is, right? None of them read their Psalms at night or read the Baltimore Catechism for their first communion, but they have remarkably similar views about what marriage is and about what sex ethics are. And that means at least that it can't be just motivated by Judaism or Christianity, or just motivated by animus, because again, to have animus against a group, you have to be aware of the group as a class of people in a robust way, which is just a very modern phenomenon in connection with same-sex attractions, for example, right? So whatever motivated their view, it wasn't homophobia. It can also provide circumstantial evidence. If they believed it, we need at least an explanation for that. One possible explanation is that it's true, is that their reflections actually led them there. And so then there's a burden on your opponent to show why that's not the right explanation. And the most important thing maybe that history can do is show us the deep historical contingency of our own views. It feels like it's just a part of the atmosphere. It's just as plain as night and day that, you know, if you really love someone, sex is okay, or that there are no harms. There are no harms that morality should care about besides kind of brute physical or psychological damage, right? All of these kinds of assumptions that are just in the background and that immediately make your argument harder to make. But they are very new assumptions. They're very new assumptions. The sexual revolution happened 50 years ago, right? The idea that the only thing of moral significance about sex is the intensity and duration of the pleasure it gives you and perhaps its ability to attach you emotionally to someone else has a very sordid and short history, right? Margaret Sanger, Alfred Kinsey, Wilhelm Reich, and not that long ago. And so what that can do for you is help you show that what seems universal and plain to common sense is actually very contingent. We wouldn't be having the debates we're having about same-sex marriage today if the sexual revolution hadn't happened, or if we hadn't had theorists in the 19th century treating homosexual attraction in such a way that it begins to be seen as picking out a class of human beings. Another thing, go on offense. Fully compatibly with what Cassy was saying about charity. Go on offense, and what do I mean by that? One is in your method. I think it's very useful. If you spend your whole time arguing that you are not a bigot, you've done something wrong, right? You're not going to get very far. First, you're going to seem like you're protesting too much, like you're actually worried that you're a bigot. Second, you're never going to get to the issues. That's just a side issue. And in fact, like I said, in a joking way, you can kind of like, okay, grant me that, now show me where my argument goes wrong, right? So I think the best thing in terms of method is to start with the reasons for your view, and then to articulate the strongest objections to the opposing view, and then address, in a very serious way, the objections to your own view. Another thing, don't be afraid to turn your opponent's arguments against them, where applicable. So, for example, a lot of people have a kind of gut view that the traditional view on marriage is anti-humane, right? It's inhumane, it's not humanistic. I actually think that a case can be made that the opposite is true. For example, Professor Estlin has written an excellent essay called A Requiem for Friendship about the way in which whenever in a culture homosexual relationships are a live option for people, that they're not sort of beyond the norm, that diminishes the quality and extent and depth of friendships. And the freedom to have passion within a friendship in a chaste way. It basically sends the whole premise, I think, of what I call the revisionist view on marriage is that marriage has no specific shape. It's just your number one relationship. It's the relationship in which other things equal, you have to share more experiences and more emotions. And that just makes people who are not married have to settle for less. They just get less, not different, but less of what makes any relationship valuable. I think that's an inhumane view. That is a view that gravely diminishes human goods like friendship. Okay, remove structural advantages to the other side. The general way of describing that structural advantage is this. It is always easier to poke holes in a received view than it is to articulate a complete positive alternative. Right? It's much easier to make an objection than to make a positive argument. And so if your position is one of just defending this 2,400-year-old tradition against somebody's bullets, then you're in trouble. What you have to do is get your opponent, your friend, whatever context it is, to say first what they actually think about sex ethics. What do they think the norms are? Where do they come from? Most people cannot give arguments for their views about sex that are not question-begging. Sex ethics is very hard to do well. Most people think, for example, that you shouldn't have sex with someone unless you're in a committed relationship with them. Where did that come from? Why is that true of sex, but not any other activity? Tennis, golf, whatever. No, really. I mean, it's part of the background. But where does it come from? And then wait and see if your friend has an argument. And if they don't, then at least you have prepared the way for your own view. Because now they're thinking, wow, yeah, how would I defend mine? And any argument then becomes much more worth listening to, much more respectable. Most people's arguments against traditional sexual norms, again, would also tell against their own, or their own sexual norms, right? And pointing this out can, again, just clear the brush. It can get rid of the extraneous or spurious objections. And then, again, the last thing just under this number, is remember that your burden is not to fend off all criticisms, and it is not to show that your opponent's view has no advantages. It's to show that on balance, given all the considerations, one view is more coherent, more explanatorily powerful than the other. Right? So again, just remember what the task is, and don't set yourself or don't allow yourself to be given a heavier burden. Another thing is appeal to people's intuitions on related issues. Again, most people think that other things equal, it's worse. You're worse off being a prostitute than being a masseuse, even if, under some weird thought experiments, like both of them involve the same psychological and physical harms. Or most people think that rape is much worse than any other forced engagement that causes the same physical and psychological harms. Why? Why is sex special? Or in the realm of marriage, most people think that marriage is special, it's a special kind of bond with someone else, and that part of what makes it distinctive is romance. And you can push on that. Ask, well, why? Why does romance, just in itself, it's just it stays in your head. It's just a feeling. It's a way of looking at another person. Does that really have that much moral significance? And they'll say, no, it's also related to the way that kind of love gets expressed in sex. Why is sex special? Is it just because it makes you feel closer to the other person? Because it expresses affection? All kinds of activities can make you feel closer, can make you express affection. And maybe in some circumstances, other activities more than sex. So why is sex special? Well, no, it really creates a special kind of union. You unite bodily. Now we're talking. How does that happen? Right? And I think that my own view, of course, that the further you push on this, the closer you get to the traditional view of marriage, on which only the kind of sex that a man and woman can have, very delicately, creates this real kind of union. And then the appearance of this other kinds of acts having the same value is sort of parasitic on the value of the central case. So there's a way of starting out with something that's totally uncontroversial and then just pushing it to see where it goes. Be very careful about personal testimony as a form of persuasion. First of all, it's much riskier than abstract arguments. It exposes you to deeper and more perverse ridicule in some cases, certainly in public contexts. It could be unseemly in what it reveals. It's often unconvincing anyway because people will just say, well, different people have different experiences, and so on. So there's probably a place for this. It's probably a place that I underestimate the value of, given the occupational hazards of doing philosophy. But for what it's worth, I think at least in public debates, that place is very limited. And the last thing is never, ever, ever play the victim, right? This is more a point about how to kind of situate yourself in the campus setting and in the university setting. Yes, call out double standards. Yes, point out where people are treating your view differently from others. Yes, make sure that you have a place at the table because you deserve one, not only by your own lights, but also by everyone else's lights. We're all about pluralism and diversity and all the rest of it. But never play the victim. Don't ask for special treatment. Don't complain about being ridiculed or about the pressures of having these views and so on. It's just beside the point. Another related point is don't protest too much. Don't tell us how many gay friends you have. Just have them. Don't point out how wonderful it is that you are dialoguing. First of all, don't ever use dialogue as a verb. Second of all, don't point out that you are dialoguing across the aisle. Look at me, we're holding hands, it's wonderful, that's what we're all about, right? Sometimes an op-ed in this vein on either side will start out where it's like the first half of it is all about that. Don't do it, just do it, live it. People will notice. Even if they don't notice, it doesn't matter. What your concern is to defend a good cause, not your liberality, open-mindedness, tolerance, capaciousness, anything else. Yeah, I think that would be the summary of what I'm trying to say. Be cheerful and defensive. Be cheerful, not defensive. And don't worry about yourself. Worry about the cause. Believe in it. And if you do, that will take care of all the rest, the style and the mechanics and the substance, because you'll be motivated to find the analogies with other moral principles, to show how an argument might cut both ways, to find distinctive arguments for your own view, and all the rest, and enjoy it. It's even if you are deeply conflict averse by temperament. It can be very fun. Thanks.
Homosexual relationships with each other, and they asked me at a circa, in one particular situation, why I believe that they shouldn't be allowed to be married, especially since I like them as people plenty, and I don't mind that they're in a relationship with each other, but marriage is where I personally draw the line between that. I don't believe that they should be able to be married, and I had trouble expressing that why, and so I'm just wondering what you guys would say in that circumstance.
So the first thing I always do in that context is, if you haven't noticed, turn the question around, right? Not in an aggressive way, and obviously these are your friends, but in a very serious way. You say, well, why is it ever legitimate to think that the state should single out some relationships and not others? Because they think so too, right? Newsweek reports, or is Newsweek defunct now? Anyway, when it was around, it reported that there are 500,000 households in the US where there are polyamorous relationships, right? So, polyamorous meaning not polygamous, not one man, several women, but group, okay? And I'm sure that for many of these people, they feel right now closeted, right? They feel like it's not their political moment, they're a sexual minority that's kind of on the fringes, that people have false and unfair assumptions about the nature of their relationships and all the rest of it. That their children are going to be stigmatized for growing up in a household that's deviant, not recognized, that they might not get the same economic and other benefits just because they don't want to lie by getting only a two-person union recognized. So granting all of that, why might it still be a good idea and in fact compatible with love for people in those situations not to recognize their unions as marriages? And then see what's said and work from there. I mean, you can, and then you do have to be prepared to say why you think that's true. And I think one quick way to point out what you think might be some of the bad effects is that, look, the norms that are traditional, to regard as traditional to marriage, sexual complementarity, monogamy, permanence, exclusivity, all of these things, I think that they are a package deal. That if you undercut one of them, or you make one of them superfluous, you deeply undermine the basis for all the others. And so that you could even believe that any kind of sexual relationship that's consensual is moral and perfectly legitimate, and still think that there would be reasons, as a matter of public policy, only to single out the ones involving sexual complementarity, because that means they get these other norms, and these other norms are the ones that justify state recognition in the first place. Because the state is mainly interested not in legally regulating tenderness, but in making sure that wherever possible, on the whole, kids grow up being reared by their married biological parents, right? And the more that you can get people, here's another thing. Again, it's now just a general assumption that legal recognition of your relationship is crucial to personal happiness, right? But even within the gay community, just 30 years ago, that was much more controversial. And in fact, some people were very much against that. They were thinking, no, they were kind of agreeing with 90% of what I'm saying. They're saying, you're right, all of these other traditional norms are a package deal with sexual complementarity, and we don't want those norms, those kinds of ideals imposed on our relationships. And now it's the opposite. So you want to push people back to the question that has now been shuffled off stage, which is, why are we recognizing these relationships as public policy in the first place, when typically the more intimate and the more personal a relationship is, the less the state's involved. It's involved in our business transactions, but not in our personal friendships. I can't sue somebody for betraying me as a friend or for revealing my secrets. If you can keep it on those questions, on why it matters as a matter of policy, I think that, in many cases, I've actually gotten agreement from people in exactly that situation. From that angle.
Yes.
I have a question for Sherif. You said that only moral arguments can produce moral conclusions, but but how would you suggest making a moral argument against someone who either has no religious background or who just accepts moral relativism?
Okay, I don't believe that these people exist. No, but I'm not trying to be flippant, so let me explain what I mean. I think that by far the most prevalent thing is not genuine moral relativism, but something that gets disguised as that, which is moral relativism about sex, right? I think a lot of people think that there are no special sexual norms, but that there are other kinds of norms. The most obvious proof of this is that most people who are relativists use it as an argument for the moral conclusion that you shouldn't impose your views on others. So they're being inconsistent with their own professed view. So it's not their view. The second thing is I don't even think that most people are actually deep down relativists about sex either. Because again, they think that non-consensual sex is a much more serious violation of someone's personal integrity than non-consensual anything else, even when you make the other factors the same psychological norm or whatever. So again, I would just start where you can start. So you can't start with Romans chapter 1, and you can't start with a very intricate and detailed moral argument that's sort of top-down deduction principles to conclusion. But you can start with these very nearby views that they have, out of which I think in most cases you can tease a moral argument.
Hey, thanks for speaking. I had a question for you. Basically, I feel like there's oftentimes you get into situations where you're talking with people about these issues, like over dinner or something with your friends, and maybe you're making good points, and maybe they're like listening respectfully, and you sort of get to this point where they say like, yeah, that's interesting, I guess, and then you leave the dining hall and maybe it bugs them for a half an hour, and then after that, like you've made no impact on them. So how do you get over that last hump of making them care, I guess?
Apathy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, many of the student groups that we work with, obviously face that kind of on a grander scale too. And this may sound hokey, but we are seeing kind of the hidden effects, which sounds funny to say that we're seeing the hidden effects, but very often you just need to have a faith or a confidence that if they're listening and saying, that's interesting, yeah, maybe some of them will forget about it and move on, in which case there's really not much you can do about that besides taking the opportunity whenever it naturally arises later, to kind of press that conversation to the next level. But very often, I would say more often than not, it is difficult for people to just kind of move on, especially if they're listening carefully and especially if they are saying that you're making good points, because these are such sensitive topics, such personal topics. Most people are very personally committed to these issues. And so, we've seen with, many of our campus groups, for example, and I'm sure many of you see this in your personal friendships as well, that, perhaps for a year or two or three, you don't actually know what type of, you don't see any real changes happening in the campus conversation, but then down the road, you see, the student newspaper is actually, asking us to comment on this issue. Whenever anything sexual comes up, they ask our student group to comment on it. Kind of one example, kind of on a grander scale, again, with our student groups is, here at Princeton, it used to be that the standard for conversation regarding matters of sexuality was that anything goes in matters of sex. That casual sex, is the norm, and it's fine, okay, you're okay, I'm okay. And then eventually, maybe 3 years or so after ANSCOM was founded, suddenly the standard became that, okay, well, we know that casual sex really doesn't satisfy what, it's not fun. It's not really, we're not really getting out of it what we hope to. But sex is okay in committed relationships. Now, of course, that's not the eventual conclusion we would want people to get to, but it's a step and it's a change in the conversation. So I would just say that, in these more personal situations, yeah, if they do forget about it and walk away, well then, you still did what you could do. But more often than not, realize that it does stay with them. I'm sure many of you have had the experience, I know I have, where you're talking to a friend who perhaps disagrees with you, does disagree with you on these issues, and then years down the road, okay, you continue to disagree on these things, but you continue to love each other as friends, right? Years down the road, you get a phone call and say, I know you're the only one who's going to give me the answer I'm looking for on this question. What do you think I should do about X? So again, have that kind of that faith, but also that kind of long-term vision and understanding of the impact of your friendship and of the significance of what you're saying.
Yes.
How would you answer if police went to the point where they would agree that sex be both procreative and unitive, and on the gay marriage thing, how do you argue that it's not unitive? Because that came up in a discussion at UNC we had a few weeks back, and I don't feel the person really gave a decent answer on that.
Yes, how do you argue that it's not unitive?
Yes.
We have to argue what counts as unity in this realm. It can't just be proximity, and it can't just be the production of a certain kind of feeling for the other person, or a certain kind of pleasure, or the increase of a certain mode of regard for them, romantic or whatever. Because that would prove too much, in short. A whole range of activities could do all of that. And most people think there's something distinctive about sex. So, what is it? Well, then you want to propose a positive alternative, and see if another positive alternative can meet it. In short, mine is something like this. It's of course not mine, it's a parroting, slavishly parroting other people like Germaine Grisey. Let's start with another case. What makes the parts of my body just one body, right? What makes my heart and lungs and all the rest of it one body? Well, is that these different parts are mutually coordinating for ultimately, if you go out far enough, a single biological end of the whole me that they compose together, which is my biological life. And there are nested unities within the individual. What makes your stomach and your intestinal tract and your esophagus and all that parts of one biological system, the digestive system? Well, they're all mutually coordinated in various ways to perform a single biological end of the whole that they compose together, which is my nourishment. Well, the remarkable thing about being a human, in fact about being a mammal, is that there is one respect in which that kind of unity, which normally obtains among the parts of a single individual body, is effected between two individuals. There is only one biological end with respect to which two whole individuals are coordinated, and it is an end that perfects them as a whole. And that is reproduction, right? Reproduction of man and woman are mutually coordinated towards the single end of the whole that they compose together. What's reproduced is the couple as a unit. So only that kind of activity, reproductive type of behavior, can produce the kind of bodily unity that obtains within a body. And that's the deep sense in which it is unitive. And the feeling it gives you and the pleasure of closeness and unity and all the rest of it is a kind of perception, sort of through your senses of that. And then you want to see if there's a good alternative conception that would not prove too much.
We have time for maybe one more question before we head to dinner. Yes.
You mentioned, Cassandra, earlier about how hopefully we're surrounded by good examples of healthy relationships. I feel like a lot of us aren't, maybe even of healthy marriages in general. And it's almost like there's two extremes. Like we can tell people, sure, it's not healthy to have sex, it's not good for you. But I feel like past that, we can't tell them too much more about how to build meaningful relationships because we might not even know that ourselves. I wonder if, either can comment on that.
Sure. Well, certainly an unfortunate reality that for either ourselves or, certainly for many of our friends, perhaps the only type of family life that they've experienced or marriage that they've experienced is a very broken one, right? And so I think, this is what's really at the heart of a lot of the discouragement and lack of hope, that our generation is seeing in regards to the types of relationships that we can engage in, what our marital and family, features look like. And I think, well, Elizabeth Marquardt, who was a keynote speaker for us last year, she writes a lot on divorce. She's a child of divorce herself. And she wrote just a very powerful article on how, sociologists will come out with these, this data saying that if you're a product of divorce, you're more likely to get divorced yourself. She's like, yeah, of course that's what the data says. That's true. That phenomenon happens, but don't give up on us, okay? Being a child of divorce, she knows, and other children of divorce know, how difficult that situation can be and how much they don't want that for themselves. Helen Albury got at this as well when she spoke about, very briefly, some of the reasons why people will get into cohabiting relationships. And even some of the sexual habits, more promiscuous habits that, more libertine norms that, our peers will engage in. Again, as I mentioned earlier, very often people are pursuing, they have these habits, or they're pursuing, they're making these choices because they're trying to achieve, happiness, right? And oftentimes we know that it can be misguided, but they sleep around so that they can know what they like, right? They get into a cohabiting relationship so that they know if they can stand that person in marriage, right? To a certain extent, they have the concerns correct. They just have the wrong avenue, for finding the answers. So, anyways, this is a long way of getting around to your question, but I guess what I would say is that I would get back to the building of culture. If for your particular community, the only resource you have, because you don't have, you don't have ready examples of stable and intact families, is, I guess we can go to Anthony Esselin here and say, read poetry and literature. It's amazing. We have so many students leading discussions now based on just beautiful pieces of literature, or really provocative social essays, right? And it's much easier for people to be able to read something that's apart from themselves and question that, and then the questions stay with them and they're able to apply it to their own situation. But all this is to say that we can, in promoting the type of culture that will help people to understand how to live out these commitments, in promoting that culture, we can both look to the great literature as well as look to the people around us, and in this respect, oftentimes we're the authors of the culture, and so certainly the Love and Fidelity Network tries to put certain resources at your disposal, to understand the nature of forgiveness, or to understand, how you can build healthy relationships, what sexual ethics mean, how you can live this out practically. But as much as you can find within your academic communities, within your friendships, and then, just within your faith communities, and I think we'll get to this a lot tonight. In fact, maybe this is the answer that I'm looking for right now, is that, many of you are people of faith. And even for those who aren't, usually, this is just a fact, usually people of faith, do tend to have longer lasting marriages, do tend to have, there's a higher incidence of, stable, intact families. And so if you look for it, and I know it's harder in some communities as opposed to others, but if you look for it, you can find those models. So just as you're building this culture on campus, really try to look for those models and connect them to the students, whether it happens to be the upperclassmen who are, having a good and healthy relationship, or whether it happens to be the university professor who invites you to his home. I don't know, Professor, if you would have anything to add to that. But.
That's right. Let's thank both Sherif